They told him she couldn't hear a single word. They swore she was broken, worthless, a burden no one wanted. So Wyatt Kerr, the loneliest rancher in Montana Territory, bought her for less than the price of a horse, and took her home through a blizzard that should have killed them both. But on the third night, when he whispered her name in the darkness, Mara Quinn turned her head, and Wyatt realized the girl they sold him had been hiding the most dangerous secret of all. She could hear everything. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The winter of 1887 came to Coldwater, Montana, like a curse wrapped in snow. It wasn't the kind of cold that bit at your fingers or froze the water in the wells. It was the kind that settled into your bones and made you wonder if spring was just a lie you'd been telling yourself. The kind of cold that made men do desperate things. Wyatt Kerr had known that kind of desperation once. It lived in the hollow of his chest, where his heart used to be, in the empty side of the bed where Sarah had slept, in the silence of a house built for a family that would never fill it. 3 years had passed since the fever took her, and in those 3 years Wyatt had learned that loneliness wasn't just an absence. It was a presence, thick and suffocating, that followed him from the barn to the house and back again. He was 42 years old and looked older. The sun had carved lines into his face like words into stone, and his hands were scarred from a lifetime of wrestling with land that didn't want to be tamed. His ranch sprawled across 200 acres of stubborn Montana soil, beautiful in its brutality, and every acre of it was his alone. That morning, he'd ridden into town for supplies he didn't need, just to remember what other human voices sounded like. The snow fell in thick curtains, turning Main Street into a ghost of itself. Most folks had the sense to stay inside, but Wyatt had never been accused of having too much sense. He was tying his horse outside the trading post when he heard the voice, sharp as broken glass, cutting through the muffled quiet of the snowfall. She's 17, healthy enough for work, and she don't complain. Can't, actually. A woman's laugh, cruel and thin. Deaf as a post since she was 12, but her hands work just fine. Wyatt turned slowly. At the end of the street, near the old Wells Fargo office that hadn't seen a stagecoach in months, a small crowd had gathered around a wagon. The crowd wasn't large, maybe 8 or 9 people, the kind who come out in a blizzard to watch someone else's misery because it makes their own seem lighter. On the back of the wagon sat a girl. She was small, wrapped in a coat too thin for the weather, her dark hair plastered to her face by the snow. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. There was something about her stillness that caught Wyatt's attention. Not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of prey that knows the predator is watching. The woman doing the talking stood beside the wagon, a thick figure in a heavy cloak, her face red from cold and something meaner than cold. She held a leather strap in one hand, and Wyatt noticed how the girl's shoulders tensed every time the woman moved. "Who'll start the bidding?" the woman called out. "She's worth $20 easy, but I'll take 15. Gotta get to Bozeman before the pass closes, and I can't feed 2 mouths all winter." "That's Eunice Vale," someone muttered near Wyatt's elbow. He turned to see old Thomas Brennan, the blacksmith, shaking his head. "Married the girl's father 2 years back. He died last summer, thrown from a horse. Woman's been working the girl like a mule ever since." "The girl's deaf?" Wyatt asked quietly. "That's what she claims." Thomas's voice carried doubt. "Though I've seen the girl jump at loud noises once or twice, but who's going to question it? Eunice says she can't hear, so she can't hear. Makes her cheaper to buy anyway." Wyatt felt something twist in his chest. He looked back at the girl, Mara, he would later learn her name was Mara Quinn, and saw her eyes flick briefly toward her stepmother, then away. There was intelligence in that glance, sharp and quick and carefully hidden. $10, a voice called out. Wyatt recognized Samuel Worth, who ran the saloon and always needed kitchen help. 12, countered another voice. Eunice Vale smiled, showing teeth. "There we go. Who'll say 15? Wyatt watched the girl's hands tighten in her lap. Her knuckles went white. She was terrified, he realized, but she'd learned not to show it. She'd learned to be still, to be silent, to be invisible. The way animals learn when visibility means pain. He thought of Sarah then, the way she used to rage against cruelty in all its forms. She'd once spent a whole week nursing a half-dead coyote back to health just because she couldn't stand the thought of anything suffering alone. Wyatt Kerr, she'd said to him once, her green eyes fierce. You got a good heart buried under all that quiet. Don't you forget it. He'd forgotten it for 3 years. Or tried to. $15, Wyatt heard himself say. The crowd turned. Eunice Vale's eyes narrowed, calculating. Mr. Kerr, didn't expect to see you bidding on anything that wasn't livestock. She's not livestock, Wyatt said quietly. She's a person. A person who can't hear a word you're saying. Eunice laughed. But if you want her, she's yours for 15, cash. Wyatt reached into his coat and counted out the bills, money he'd been saving for a new plow, for fence posts, for 100 things the ranch needed. His hand hesitated for just a moment before he handed it over. Eunice snatched the bills, counted them twice, then nodded toward the wagon. She's all yours. Good luck getting any conversation out of her. The crowd began to disperse, people hunching back into their coats and hurrying toward warm buildings. Wyatt approached the wagon slowly, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The girl, Mara, watched him come with eyes the color of storm clouds, wary and unblinking. Miss, Wyatt said quietly, though if she truly was deaf, the words were just air. My name's Wyatt Kerr. I've got a ranch about an hour's ride from here. I need help with the house, and you need a place that's not the back of a wagon in a blizzard. Seems like maybe we can help each other. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded once. Wyatt exhaled a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He offered his hand to help her down from the wagon. She hesitated. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of one danger against another, then took it. Her hand was ice-cold even through his glove, and he could feel it trembling. Behind them, Eunice Vale had already driven her wagon around the corner, disappearing into the snow without a backward glance. Can you ride? Wyatt asked, then felt foolish. She couldn't hear him. He gestured instead, pointing to his horse, then to her, making a riding motion. Mara shook her head and pointed to the horse, then made a gesture like sitting behind someone. Wyatt understood. She could ride, but not alone. Not in this weather. All right, then. He swung up into the saddle, then offered his arm. Hold on tight. It's going to be a cold ride. She climbed up behind him, light as a bird, and wrapped her arms around his waist. He could feel her shivering immediately. She was soaked through, probably had been for hours. Wyatt shrugged out of his heavy coat and twisted to drape it over her shoulders. She tried to refuse, pushing it back toward him, but he held up a hand in a gesture that needed no words. Keep it. Then he turned the horse toward home and rode into the storm. The ride took longer than an hour. The snow came down so thick that Wyatt could barely see 10 feet ahead, and twice he had to dismount to check landmarks, a particular twisted pine, a rock formation that looked like a broken tooth. Behind him, Mara clung to his back, her grip never loosening, never complaining, though he knew she must be frozen to the bone. When the dark shape of his ranch house finally emerged from the white, Wyatt felt relief like whiskey burning down his throat. He guided the horse to the barn, dismounted, and helped Mara down. She could barely stand, her legs stiff from cold and an hour of gripping the horse. Come on, he said, supporting her weight. House first, then I'll see to the animals. He half-carried her across the yard to the front door, kicked it open, and brought her inside to the fireplace. The house was cold. He'd been gone all day, but he had wood stacked and ready. Within minutes, he had a fire blazing, orange light pushing back the gray shadows. Mara stood exactly where he'd left her, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, staring at the flames like she'd never seen fire before. Wyatt pulled the rocking chair closer to the hearth. Sit, he said, guiding her gently by the shoulders. She sat, still trembling. He found blankets, clean ones, Sarah's quilts that he'd kept wrapped in cedar, and piled them around her until only her face showed. Stay here, he said, pointing at her, then at the chair, hoping she understood. I'll be back. He went back out into the storm to tend to his horse, working quickly, his hands numb. The barn was warmer than the house had been, the animal's body heat keeping the worst of the cold at bay. He fed the horse, rubbed him down, checked on the 3 cows and dozen chickens that were all that remained of what had once been a thriving ranch. When he returned to the house, stamping snow from his boots, he found Mara exactly where he'd left her, staring into the fire. But she'd pulled the blankets tighter around herself, and her shivering had slowed. That was good. Wyatt moved to the kitchen, really just a corner of the main room with a stove and a table, and began pulling out supplies. He had venison from a deer he'd shot last week, potatoes from the root cellar, an onion, some dried herbs Sarah had planted years ago that still somehow grew in the garden every summer. He cooked the way he did everything, quietly, methodically, without wasted motion. While the stew simmered, he watched the girl from the corner of his eye. She hadn't moved, hadn't looked around, hadn't done anything but stare at the fire, like she was afraid that any movement might remind him she existed, might make him change his mind about the bargain. It broke something in him, that stillness. What had been done to this girl to make her so afraid? When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 bowls and carried them to the table. Then he approached Mara slowly, the way you'd approach a half-wild horse, and touched her shoulder gently. She flinched, actually pulled away from him, and Wyatt's jaw tightened. He held up both hands in a gesture of peace, then pointed at the table, at the steaming bowls. Understanding crossed her face. She stood slowly, still wrapped in blankets, and came to the table. Wyatt pulled out a chair for her, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat. They ate in silence. Wyatt, because he'd forgotten how to make conversation, and Mara because she supposedly couldn't hear it anyway. He watched her eat, small bites, careful, like food was something that might be taken away at any moment. She finished everything in the bowl, then sat with her hands in her lap, waiting. Wyatt stood and retrieved something from the shelf near the door, a slate and a piece of chalk, left over from when he'd briefly tried to teach himself accounting. He brought them to the table and set them in front of her, then wrote slowly in clear letters. "Can you write?" Mara stared at the slate for a long moment. Then she picked up the chalk with trembling fingers and formed 2 words in shaky, uncertain letters. "Thank you." Wyatt smiled for the first time in longer than he could remember. "You're welcome, Len," he said out loud, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say it anyway. Then he wrote on the slate, "You're safe here." She read it, and something happened to her face, a crack in the careful blankness she wore like armor. Her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, and she nodded once, quickly, before looking away. Wyatt cleared the dishes, moving around the kitchen with the ease of 3 years' practice. He'd learned to cook after Sarah died, learned to clean, learned all the things he'd left to her because that was how they divided the world between them. At first, every task had felt like a betrayal, a reminder that she was gone. Now they were just tasks, empty of everything but necessity. When the kitchen was clean, he turned to find Mara still sitting at the table, watching him with those storm cloud eyes. He wrote on the slate, "There's a room upstairs. It's cold but has a bed. Or you can sleep down here by the fire tonight." She pointed at the floor near the fireplace without hesitation. Wyatt nodded. He retrieved more blankets from the chest under the stairs, thick wool ones, and made a pallet near the hearth. Then he banked the fire, adding 2 large logs that would burn slow and steady through the night. Mara curled up on the pallet like a cat, pulling the blankets over herself until only the top of her dark hair showed. Wyatt stood looking down at her for a moment, this girl who had somehow become his responsibility, this stranger who had been sold like property and who trembled at every sudden movement. "You're safe now, girl," he said quietly, knowing she couldn't hear. "Whatever they took from you, whatever they did, they won't do it again. That's a promise." He climbed the stairs to his own room, the one he'd shared with Sarah, the one where he still slept on his side of the bed, out of habit. He lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl around the house, and wondered what the hell he'd done. He'd bought a girl, a deaf girl who couldn't hear him, couldn't talk to him, who flinched when he touched her shoulder. He didn't need help running the ranch. He'd been doing it alone for 3 years. He didn't need company. He'd chosen solitude. He didn't need complications, and this girl was nothing but complications wrapped in a too thin coat and terrified silence. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her sitting on that wagon in the snow, so still, so resigned to whatever came next. And he heard Sarah's voice in his memory. "You got a good heart buried under all that quiet. Don't you forget it." He'd forgotten it. But maybe this girl, Mara, maybe she was his chance to remember. Downstairs, Mara lay awake by the fire, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The house was warm. The blankets were soft. The man who'd bought her had been gentle, had fed her, had given her a slate to write on like her thoughts mattered. It was the kindest she'd been treated in 2 years, and that terrified her more than anything Eunice had ever done. Because kindness, Mara had learned, was the most dangerous thing of all. Kindness made you hope. Kindness made you trust. And when that kindness was taken away, and it always was, eventually, the loss was worse than if you'd never had it at all. She thought about running. The storm would kill her, but maybe that would be better than waiting for this man, this Wyatt Kerr, with his sad eyes and gentle hands, to show his true nature. They all did, eventually. Her father had been kind once, before the drink got him. Eunice had been kind too at first, when she'd been courting Mara's father. Before the wedding, before the inheritance, before Mara became an inconvenience instead of a stepdaughter. But something kept her frozen on the palate. Maybe it was the warmth of the fire. Maybe it was the exhaustion that went bone deep. Or maybe it was the way he'd said, "You're welcome," after she'd written, "Thank you," like her gratitude mattered, like she was a person and not a possession. She reached up and touched her left ear gently. It had been 5 years since the fever that had stolen her hearing, or so everyone believed. The truth was more complicated, more dangerous, more secret than anyone could know. The truth was that Mara Quinn could hear perfectly well. She'd been 12 when she learned that men told their secrets around girls they thought were deaf. She'd been 13 when she realized that her stepmother talked more freely when she thought Mara couldn't hear her plans. She'd been 14 when she understood that being deaf was armor, protection, a way to become invisible. And she'd been 15 when she made her choice. Better to be thought broken and safe than whole and in danger. For 2 years, she'd lived in perfect silence, never reacting to sounds, never speaking, never giving herself away. For 2 years, it had worked. Eunice had treated her like livestock, yes, but livestock was predictable. Livestock was safe. Until today, when Eunice had decided that livestock could be sold. Mara's hands clenched under the blankets. She'd heard everything in that wagon, every word of the auction, every cruel joke about the deaf girl. She'd heard Wyatt Kerr's voice when he'd said, "She's not livestock, she's a person." She'd heard the way his breath caught when he draped his coat over her shoulders, like even that small act of kindness cost him something. And tonight, as she'd sat by the fire pretending not to hear, she'd listened to him moving around the kitchen. She'd heard the gentle way he'd set the bowls on the table, like he was afraid of startling her. She'd heard him whisper, "You're welcome," after she'd written her thanks. And she'd heard what he'd said before climbing the stairs, that promise he'd made to a girl he thought couldn't hear him. "You're safe now, girl. Whatever they took from you, whatever they did, they won't do it again." That's a promise. Tears slid hot down her temples, soaking into the blanket beneath her head. She bit her lip to keep from making any sound, from giving herself away. Because if he knew, if he ever discovered that she'd been deceiving him from the moment they met, what would he do? Would he send her back to Eunice? Sell her to someone else? Or worse, would he be hurt by the lie, the betrayal of his trust before that trust had even been earned? No, she couldn't risk it. She would keep her secret, would stay deaf and silent and safe, would work hard and stay invisible and never ever let him know the truth. Outside, the storm raged against the house like it was trying to get in. But inside, the fire crackled softly, and for the first time in 2 years, Mara felt warm. She closed her eyes and let herself pretend, just for tonight, that maybe, she'd finally found a place where kindness wouldn't turn to cruelty, where promises weren't just pretty lies told by people who meant to hurt you, where a lonely rancher and a girl who wasn't really deaf could both stop hiding, if only they were brave enough to try. But bravery, Mara knew, was the hardest thing of all, especially when you'd forgotten what it felt like to be anything but afraid. Morning came late to the ranch, the sun hidden behind clouds that promised more snow. Wyatt woke to silence, the same silence he'd woken to for 3 years, but something felt different. Then he remembered. The girl downstairs. Mara. He dressed quickly in the cold bedroom, pulling on wool pants and a thick flannel shirt, his movements practiced and efficient. When he came down the stairs, he found the fire already blazing and Mara standing by the window, still wrapped in blankets, staring out at the white landscape. She must have heard his footsteps. No, he corrected himself, she couldn't have. But somehow she sensed his presence and turned, her eyes meeting his with that same wary intelligence he'd noticed yesterday. In the morning light, He could see her more clearly. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 17 or 18, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and a face that would have been pretty if it wasn't so thin, so marked by hardship. Wyatt gestured toward the table, then to himself, miming eating. She nodded and moved to sit, settling into the same chair she'd used last night. He noticed she chose the seat that put her back to the wall, where she could see both the door and the windows. Smart girl. He made breakfast: cornmeal mush with molasses, coffee so strong it could strip paint, bread from a loaf he'd bought in town 3 days ago. Basic food, bachelor food, but it was hot, and there was plenty of it. He set a bowl in front of her and watched as she ate slowly, carefully, like she was still waiting for someone to snatch it away. When they'd finished, Wyatt retrieved the slate and wrote, "I need to check the animals. You can stay inside where it's warm." Mara read it, then shook her head. She pointed at herself, then at him, then made a gesture that clearly meant, "I'll come with you." Wyatt hesitated. It was bitter cold outside, and she'd already been half frozen yesterday. But there was determination in her expression, and something else, a need to be useful, to prove her worth, to earn her keep. He recognized it because he'd felt the same way 1,000 times, that need to justify your existence through work. He nodded and found her a better coat, one of Sarah's old ones that he'd kept for reasons he couldn't explain. It was too big for Mara, but it was wool and thick, and it would keep her warm. He showed her how to wrap a scarf around her face against the wind, and then they went out together into the cold. The barn was dim and sweet-smelling, full of animal warmth and the rustle of hay. Wyatt showed her where everything was: the feed bins, the water buckets, the stalls. He worked steadily, mucking out the horse's stall, checking the cows, gathering eggs from the chickens who complained loudly about the disturbance. Mara watched everything with fierce attention, memorizing, learning. When Wyatt handed her a bucket and pointed at the water pump, she took it without hesitation. The pump was outside, exposed to the wind, and the handle was stiff with cold. Wyatt moved to help her, but she shook her head stubbornly and worked the handle herself, her small hands gripping tight, pumping until water gushed out in a frigid stream. She carried the heavy bucket back to the barn, water sloshing over the sides, and Wyatt saw her hands were red with cold. He took the bucket from her and set it down, then caught her hands in his own. She froze, fear flashing across her face, but he just held her hands gently and breathed warm air on them, rubbing them carefully until some color returned. "You've got to wear gloves in this weather," he said, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say it anyway. "You'll lose your fingers otherwise." He found an old pair of his gloves and put them on her hands. They were comically large, swallowing her hands entirely, but they were lined with wool and they'd keep her warm. She looked down at the gloves, then up at him, and for the first time since he'd bought her, something like a smile touched her lips. Small, uncertain, but real. They worked together for the next hour, falling into a rhythm. Wyatt would start a task, and Mara would watch, learn, then help. She was quick and careful, never wasting motion, never complaining, though he could see she was tired. When they finally returned to the house, both of them were red-cheeked and breathing hard from the cold. Wyatt built up the fire again and set a pot of coffee on the stove. While it heated, he wrote on the slate, "You did good work. Thank you." Mara took the chalk and wrote back, "I want to help. I can work." "You're not a servant," Wyatt wrote. "You're—" He paused, not sure how to finish. What was she? Not family. Not an employee exactly. Not a guest. The word that came to mind was guest, but that didn't fit either. Finally, he wrote, "You're staying here. That's enough." She stared at the words for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she took the chalk again. "Why did you buy me?" It was a fair question. Wyatt looked at her, at this girl who had been sold like property, who'd learned to make herself small and silent and invisible, and tried to find words for something he barely understood himself. He wrote slowly, "Because no one should be sold, because you looked scared, because I could." It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't poetry. But it was true, and she seemed to understand that. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, then wrote, "I won't be trouble." "You're not trouble," he wrote back. Then, because he needed her to understand, "You're safe here." That word again, safe. He'd said it last night, written it this morning. He meant it, but he wondered if she could believe it. How long did it take for someone who'd been hurt to believe they were safe? He didn't know. He only knew he'd keep saying it until maybe, someday, she'd trust him enough to believe it. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Wyatt and Mara would rise with the sun, eat breakfast in companionable silence, then work together through the morning, feeding animals, checking fences, hauling wood, all the endless tasks that kept a ranch running in winter. The work was hard and the cold was brutal, but Mara never complained, never shirked, never asked for special treatment. In the afternoons, when the light started to fail, they'd return to the house. Wyatt would cook, simple food, filling food, and they'd eat together at the table. Then, in the evenings, they'd sit by the fire. Wyatt would whittle or mend tack or read from one of his handful of books, and Mara would sit across from him, sometimes doing needlework on clothes that needed mending, sometimes just staring into the flames. They communicated through the slate, short exchanges about practical things. Snow coming, more wood needed. Chickens stopped laying. Check for eggs in the morning. Simple words for a simple life. But there were moments, small moments, when Wyatt caught glimpses of something more. Once he saw her standing in the barn doorway at sunset, watching the light turn the snow pink and gold, her expression almost peaceful. Another time, he found her in the kitchen, holding one of Sarah's mixing bowls, running her fingers over the blue glaze like she was memorizing its smoothness. And once, when he came in from checking the fences, he heard, or thought he heard, a sound like humming, soft and tuneless, coming from upstairs. But when he climbed the stairs, the sound stopped, and Mara was just standing at the window of the spare room, looking out at nothing. He must have imagined it. Deaf people couldn't hum, could they? It was on the 8th day that everything changed. Wyatt had been repairing a section of fence that had blown down in the night's wind. The work was cold and frustrating, his hands stiff despite the gloves, the fence post stubborn in the frozen ground. He'd told Mara to stay inside, no need for both of them to freeze, but when he turned around, there she was, carrying a thermos of hot coffee across the snow. She'd done this before, brought him coffee or soup when he was working outside, but this time something was different. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, her head tilted slightly, her eyes focused on something he couldn't see. Wyatt turned to follow her gaze, but saw nothing unusual, just the line of pine trees at the edge of his property, their branches heavy with snow. Then he heard it, a bird calling. A hawk, probably, its cry sharp and clear in the cold air. When he looked back at Mara, her expression had changed. Her lips were slightly parted, her eyes wide, and she was standing perfectly still, but not the careful stillness she usually maintained. This was different. This was the stillness of someone listening. "Mara," Wyatt said quietly, testing. She didn't react, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him at all. "Mara," he said again, louder this time. Nothing. But the hawk called again, and Wyatt saw it, clear as day, saw her eyes track toward the sound, saw her shoulders tense slightly, saw the way her breath caught. His heart began to pound. He moved slowly, carefully, positioning himself where she couldn't see him in her peripheral vision. Then he clapped his hands together once, hard, the sound cracking through the cold air like a gunshot. Mara jumped, actually jumped, her whole body startling, the thermos slipping from her hands and landing in the snow. She spun toward him, eyes wide with something that looked like panic, and in that moment Wyatt knew. She could hear. Maybe not everything. Maybe not well. But she could hear something, and she'd been hiding it from Eunice, hiding it from the people in town, hiding it from him. They stared at each other across the snow, and Wyatt watched her face cycle through emotions: fear, guilt, defiance, resignation. She was waiting, he realized, waiting for his anger, waiting for him to drag her back to town and demand his money back, waiting for the punishment she clearly expected. But Wyatt felt no anger. What he felt was something more complicated. Betrayal, yes, but also understanding. And underneath it all, a strange kind of relief. Because if she could hear, even a little, then maybe she wasn't as alone as he'd thought. Maybe neither of them were. He walked toward her slowly, watching her tense like she might bolt. When he reached her, he bent down and picked up the thermos, brushing snow from its surface. Then he looked at her and spoke clearly, enunciating each word. "How much can you hear?" She stared at him, her mouth working, fighting with herself. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered, "Some things. Loud things." Her voice was rough from disuse, hesitant, but it was there, real. She could speak. "How long?" Wyatt asked. "How long have you been pretending?" 5 years. The words came easier now, like a dam breaking. "Since I was 12, I had fever. Everyone thought it made me deaf, but it didn't, not completely. I can hear loud sounds, shouting, thunder. If someone speaks close to me, sometimes I hear words." "Why?" It was the only question that mattered. Why hide it? Mara looked down at her hands, at the 2 large gloves he'd given her. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "Because people say things around deaf girls. Important things. Secret things. My stepmother, she talked about selling my father's land, about getting rid of me, about men she'd meet in town. She said it all where I could hear because she thought I couldn't." "You were protecting yourself," Wyatt said slowly, understanding dawning. "I was surviving." Mara's eyes met his, fierce now, defensive. "You don't know what it was like. After my father died, I was alone. Eunice could have done anything, sent me to an asylum, married me off to the first man who'd have me, worked me until I dropped. But a deaf girl is worth less, not worth the trouble, easier to ignore. Until she decided to sell you." "Until she decided to sell me." Mara's voice cracked. "I knew it was coming. I heard her talking to a man in town asking about orphanages, about workhouses. I knew she was planning something, but I didn't think she'd—" "Sell you from the back of a wagon like livestock," Wyatt finished quietly. Mara nodded, tears tracking down her cold, reddened cheeks. I'm sorry I lied to you. I know you paid money for me, thinking I was broken. If you want to take me back, if you want your money back, I understand. I'll go." "Go?" Wyatt stared at her. "Go where? Back to Eunice?" "Anywhere. I don't know. It doesn't matter." "It matters." Wyatt's voice was firm. "And you're not going anywhere." Mara looked up at him, confused and wary. "But I lied to you." "Yes, you did." Wyatt felt a smile tugging at his mouth despite everything. "And I understand why. You've been lied to, used, sold. Why should you trust me? Why should you trust anyone?" "Then you're not angry?" "I'm not angry." He paused, considering. "I'm relieved, I think. All this time I've been writing on that damn slate, wondering if you were lonely, if you missed hearing voices. And all along you could hear me. Some things, anyway." "I heard you," Mara whispered. "That first night. You said I was safe. You thought I couldn't hear, but I did. And I didn't know whether to believe you or not. Do you believe me now?" She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to." "Good." Wyatt held out his hand. "Come on. Coffee's getting cold, and we both need to warm up. We can talk inside." Mara took his hand, and together they walked back to the house. The conversation that followed lasted hours, punctuated by silences when words failed, when the slate became necessary again because Wyatt's voice was too quiet or Mara's hearing faltered. She told him everything, about her father, a good man who'd drunk himself to death after her mother died, about Eunice, who'd seemed kind until the wedding, until the inheritance, until she got what she wanted, about the fever that had damaged Mara's hearing but not destroyed it, about the choice she'd made at 12 years old to be deaf, to be silent, to be invisible, because invisible meant safe. "I got good at it," she said, sitting cross-legged by the fire, her voice growing stronger with use. "I learned not to react to sounds, not to turn when someone called my name, not to jump at loud noises. It became second nature after a while. Like being deaf was just who I was." "Except it wasn't," Wyatt said. "Except it wasn't," she agreed. "And sometimes I'd forget. I'd hear a bird singing, and I'd want to turn toward it, to find it, to listen. Or I'd hear Eunice talking to herself in the kitchen, complaining about me, and I'd want to scream at her that I could hear every word. But I couldn't. Because if she knew I could hear, she'd know you knew things you shouldn't, Wyatt finished. Yes. Mara hugged her knees to her chest. And she'd have gotten rid of me faster. Or worse, she'd have used it against me somehow. I don't know. I just knew I couldn't let her find out. Wyatt poured more coffee, thinking. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the snow orange and purple. What about talking? He asked. You can speak fine. How'd you hide that? I just didn't speak. Mara shrugged. People assumed if I couldn't hear, I couldn't talk. They didn't know I'd learned to talk before the fever. I was 7 when my mother died, and she'd taught me to read and write and speak properly. So when everyone decided I was deaf, they assumed I'd never learned to speak, and I let them think it. 5 years. Wyatt shook his head. 5 years of silence. That must have been hard. It was lonely, Mara admitted quietly. Sometimes I'd go into the barn and whisper to the animals, just to hear my own voice, just to remember I could speak, but it was safer than the alternative. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn. Then Wyatt said, What do you want to do now? Mara looked at him, startled. What do you mean? I mean, you don't have to pretend anymore. Not here. You can speak when you want to. You can admit when you hear things. You don't have to be invisible. But what if someone finds out? What if Eunice sold you, Wyatt said flatly. She took money and signed you over to me. She's got no claim on you anymore. And even if she tried, I'd tell her to go to hell. A startled laugh burst from Mara's throat, and she immediately clapped her hand over her mouth like she'd done something wrong. But Wyatt was grinning. You've got a good laugh, he said. Be ashamed to waste it. Mara lowered her hand slowly, a smile playing at her lips. I haven't laughed in a long time. Then we'll have to fix that. Wyatt stood and stretched, his joints popping. But for now, how about dinner? I'm starving, and I bet you are too. They worked together in the kitchen, and for the first time, they could talk while they worked. Small talk, simple talk, but it felt revolutionary. Mara asked about the ranch, how long he'd owned it, what he grew in the summer. Wyatt asked about her childhood, the good parts before the fever and the loss. My mother used to sing, Mara said, peeling potatoes, every morning while she made breakfast. She had a beautiful voice. I wish I could remember more of her songs. What about your father? What was he like before the drink got him? Mara's voice was matter-of-fact. He was wonderful, strong and funny and kind. He used to carry me on his shoulders when we'd walk to town. After my mother died, it was like part of him died too. He tried for a while, tried to be both parents, but the grief was too much, I think. I understand that, Wyatt said quietly. Mara glanced at him. Your wife? Sarah. She died 3 years ago. Fever, like what you had, but hers was worse. She was gone in 4 days. He stirred the pot on the stove, not looking at Mara. This was her house, her dream. She wanted a ranch, wanted land of our own, wanted to build something that would last. I bought this place for her, and she made it a home. Then she died, and I've been... He trailed off. Living in her ghost, Mara finished softly. Yeah. Wyatt glanced at her, surprised by her understanding. Yeah, that's exactly what I've been doing. Is that why you bought me? Mara asked. Because you were lonely? Maybe partly. Wyatt considered the question honestly, but mostly because when I saw you on that wagon, I saw someone who needed help, and I thought maybe Sarah would have wanted me to help if I could. She sounds like she was a good person. She was the best person I ever knew. Wyatt smiled sadly. You would have liked her. She was always bringing home strays, hurt animals, lonely people, anyone who needed a friend. She'd have taken you in without a second thought. I'm glad you did, Mara said. Even if it meant lying to you at first, I'm glad you bought me instead of someone else. They ate dinner by the fire, and for the first time their silence was comfortable instead of awkward. Wyatt noticed how different Mara seemed now that her secret was out. Her shoulders less tense, her movements less careful, like a weight had been lifted. She still jumped at unexpected sounds sometimes, still had that wariness in her eyes, but she was more present somehow, more real. After dinner, Wyatt brought out a deck of cards, old and worn, the corners soft from years of use, and taught Mara how to play rummy. She caught on quickly, and soon they were playing in earnest, trash-talking each other like old friends. "You're cheating," Wyatt accused when she won the third game in a row. "I'm not cheating," Mara protested, laughing. "You're just bad at cards." "I'm not bad at cards. I'm just distracted." "By what?" "By trying to figure out if you can actually hear me shuffling or if you're just reading my face." Mara grinned. "Maybe both." They played until the fire burned low and Mara's eyes started drooping. Wyatt banked the coals and helped her make her pallet by the hearth. She still preferred sleeping downstairs, and he understood why. Upstairs meant isolation, meant doors that could be locked, meant trap. Downstairs meant escape routes, meant being able to hear if anyone came in, meant safety. "Wyatt," Mara said as he turned toward the stairs. He looked back. "Yeah? Thank you for not being angry, for understanding." "Nothing to thank me for." He paused, then added, "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we've got to check the south fence, and it's going to be cold." "I'll be ready." Wyatt climbed the stairs to his room, but sleep was a long time coming. He lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around him, thinking about the day's revelations. The girl downstairs wasn't who he'd thought she was. She was smarter, more complicated, braver than he'd imagined. She'd survived things that would have broken someone weaker. She'd made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. And she'd trusted him enough to tell the truth. That meant something. He wasn't sure what yet, but it meant something. Downstairs, Mara lay awake too, staring at the dying embers of the fire. She'd told him the truth, most of it anyway. She'd told him she could hear some things, that she'd been pretending, that she'd been protecting herself. She hadn't told him everything. Hadn't told him about the things she'd overheard Eunice say, the plans and schemes and cruelties. Hadn't told him about the man Eunice had been meeting in secret, the one who'd promised to help her sell the land if Mara was out of the way. Hadn't told him about the night she'd heard Eunice talking about poison, about accidents, about ways to make a problem disappear. Those secrets she kept. Not because she didn't trust Wyatt, she was learning to trust him, slowly, carefully, but because some secrets were too dangerous to share, some knowledge was too heavy for another person to carry. But for the first time in 5 years, Mara felt something like hope. She'd spoken today, used her voice, laughed, played cards, been treated like a person instead of a possession. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was close enough to taste it, and that was more than she'd dared to dream about in a very long time. The weeks that followed brought a thaw that had nothing to do with the weather. Snow still buried the ranch under white silence, and the wind still howled through the valley like a living thing. But inside the house, something had shifted. The air felt lighter somehow, warmer, like the walls themselves were breathing easier now that the truth had been spoken. Mara still communicated mostly through gestures and the slate during the day, especially when they were working outside where the wind made hearing difficult. But in the evenings, by the fire, she would speak. Her voice was quiet and careful at first, rusty from years of disuse, but it grew stronger each day. She told Wyatt stories about her childhood, about her mother's garden, and her father's terrible jokes. She asked him questions about ranching, about the seasons, about what the land looked like when it wasn't buried in snow. In spring, Wyatt told her one night, whittling a new handle for a broken tool, the meadow beyond the barn turns purple with wildflowers. Lupines, Sarah called them. She'd pick them by the armful and fill every room with them, said they smelled like honey and sunshine. "I'd like to see that," Mara said softly, mending one of his shirts by the firelight. "I don't remember much color, just white snow and gray sky." "You'll see it. Another month, maybe 6 weeks, and the snow will start melting. Then you'll see more color than you know what to do with." Mara smiled, ducking her head over her needlework. These moments had become precious to her, the quiet evenings, the simple conversations, the sense of being seen and heard and valued. But underneath the growing comfort, fear still lived. Fear that this peace was temporary, that something would shatter it, that kindness would curdle into cruelty the way it always had before. She tried not to think about Eunice, about what her stepmother might do if she found out Mara wasn't really deaf. Tried not to remember the things she'd overheard, the dangerous secrets she carried. But late at night, when the house was dark and Wyatt was asleep upstairs, The memories would come creeping back. It was during the third week that the stranger arrived. Mara was in the barn, scattering feed for the chickens, when she heard the horse approaching. She froze, her body going still the way it had learned to do when danger was near. Through the barn door, she could see a rider coming up the long path from the road, a big man on a bigger horse, his coat dark against the snow. She set down the feed bucket carefully and moved to the corner of the barn where she could watch without being seen. The rider pulled up in front of the house, dismounted, and knocked on the door. When no one answered, he knocked again, harder. Wyatt emerged from the woodshed, an axe in his hands, his expression wary. Mara watched as the two men spoke, their voices too distant and quiet for her to hear clearly. She caught fragments, Eunice Vale, and girl, and legal matters, and her blood went cold. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes. The stranger handed Wyatt something, papers, it looked like, and Wyatt's face went hard as stone. He said something sharp, and the stranger held up his hands in a placating gesture. More words were exchanged, then the stranger mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing back down the path the way he'd come. Wyatt stood in the yard for a long moment, staring at the papers in his hand. Then he looked up and saw Mara watching from the barn doorway. "Come inside," he called. "We need to talk." Mara's legs felt weak as she crossed the yard. Inside the house, Wyatt had spread the papers on the table, his jaw tight with anger. "What is it?" Mara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Legal document from Eunice's lawyer." Wyatt's words were clipped. "She's claiming the sale wasn't valid. Says she was coerced, that she didn't understand what she was signing, that you're still under her guardianship." The world tilted. Mara grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. "She can't. She sold me. She took your money. She's claiming she had no right to sell you in the first place. That you're not property, you're her ward, and she wants you back." Wyatt looked up, and Mara saw fury in his eyes. Not at her, but for her. "She's got until spring to file a formal complaint with the territorial court. If she does, there'll be a hearing." "She'll win." Mara's voice was hollow. "She's my stepmother. She has legal rights, and I'm just—" "You're not just anything," Wyatt interrupted. "You're a person, and you're an adult. 17's old enough to make your own choices in Montana territory." "But the law's complicated when it comes to women and guardianship. I know that." Wyatt ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "But here's what I also know. Eunice took money for you. She signed a bill of sale. She gave up her claim when she did that, whatever her lawyer says now." "Why would she want me back?" Mara tried to think through the panic clouding her mind. "She hated me. She wanted rid of me. Why would she—" She stopped, understanding dawning cold and sick. "The land." "What land?" "My father's land. He left it to me, not to Eunice. 200 acres north of Coldwater, with water rights and timber, but I can't claim it until I'm 21. Or until I marry." Mara's hands clenched into fists. "She's been trying to find a way to get it. If I'm back under her guardianship, she controls everything until I'm 21. She could sell it, forge my signature, do whatever she wants." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, processing. "That's why she sold you. To get rid of you so she could claim the land was abandoned, that you'd run off or died. But something must have gone wrong. Maybe someone questioned it. Maybe the lawyer told her she needed me alive and under her control to make it legal." Mara felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I have to go back. If there's a hearing, if the court sides with her, you're not going back." Wyatt's voice was flat, certain. "I don't care what the law says. You're not going back to a woman who sold you like livestock." "Then what do we do?" Wyatt looked down at the papers again, thinking hard. When he looked up, there was something calculating in his expression. "We get married." Mara stared at him. "What?" "If you're married, Eunice has no claim on you. Her guardianship ends. The land becomes yours to control, not hers." Wyatt spoke quickly, working through the logic. "It's a legal solution, clean, simple." "Marriage isn't simple," Mara said, her voice shaking. "Marriage is... It's a piece of paper that protects you." Wyatt held up his hands. "I'm not talking about a real marriage. I'm talking about a legal arrangement. You'd keep your room, your space, your choices. Nothing would have to change except your legal status." Mara backed away from the table, her mind spinning. "You'd do that?" You'd marry me just to protect me from Eunice? Yes. No hesitation. If you want me to. If you're willing. But why? You barely know me. You bought me 3 weeks ago. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not. Wyatt's voice softened. But Sarah would have done it in a heartbeat, and I've been trying to figure out what she'd want me to do ever since she died. This, helping you, it feels right. It feels like something she'd approve of. Mara pressed her hands to her face, trying to think. Marriage. To Wyatt Kerr, this quiet man who'd shown her more kindness in 3 weeks than Eunice had in 2 years. It made sense legally. It would solve everything, but marriage was permanent. Marriage was binding. Marriage was, I need time, she said finally. I need to think. Take all the time you need, Wyatt said. We've got weeks before anything happens. But Mara, he waited until she looked at him. Whatever you decide, I'm not letting Eunice take you. We'll figure something out. That night, Mara lay awake by the fire, turning Wyatt's proposal over in her mind. Marriage as protection. Marriage as strategy. Marriage as a shield against Eunice's machinations. It should have been simple. It should have been an easy choice. But nothing about it felt simple. She thought about Wyatt, about the way he moved through the world with quiet competence, about his patience teaching her ranch work, his careful consideration of her comfort, the way he'd accepted her lies without anger. He was a good man. She believed that now. But good men could still disappoint you. Good men could still change their minds. And marriage, even a marriage in name only, meant trusting someone with everything. Her future, her freedom, her life. Could she do that? Could she trust that much? She was still awake when she heard Wyatt come downstairs in the pre-dawn darkness. He moved quietly, trying not to disturb her, but Mara sat up. Can't sleep? He asked softly. Too much thinking. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Can I ask you something? Anything. If we got married, if I said yes, would you expect... She trailed off, not sure how to phrase it. Wyatt seemed to understand. No, I told you. Nothing would change except the legal paperwork. You'd be protected, that's all. This house has 2 bedrooms. You could have the upstairs room, the one Sarah and I used to... He cleared his throat. The point is, you'd have your own space, your own privacy, your own choices. And if someday you wanted to really marry someone you loved, then we'd figure it out. Wyatt shrugged. An annulment maybe, if that's what needed to happen. But Mara, I'm 42 years old. I had my love, my real marriage. Sarah was it for me. I'm not looking for that again. That's sad, Mara said quietly. Maybe. Or maybe it's just how things are. He moved to the stove and started building up the fire. Some people get one great love in their life. I got mine. I'm grateful for it, even though it ended too soon. Mara watched him work. This man who'd loved so deeply that he couldn't imagine loving again. There was something both beautiful and heartbreaking about that kind of devotion. All right, she heard herself say. Wyatt turned. All right, what? All right, I'll marry you, if you're sure, if you really want to do this. He crossed the room and knelt beside her pallet, his eyes serious. I'm sure. Are you? I'm terrified, Mara admitted. But I'm more terrified of going back to Eunice, so yes, I'm sure. Then we'll do it right. We'll go to town, file the paperwork, make it legal and binding so Eunice can't touch you. He held out his hand. Partners? Mara took his hand and shook it solemnly. Partners. They planned it for the following week when the weather cleared enough for the ride to town. Wyatt explained they'd need to see the county clerk, get a marriage license, find someone to perform the ceremony. It would be simple, quick, businesslike, nothing romantic or elaborate, just a legal transaction to protect them both. But as the days passed, Mara found herself thinking about the wedding more than she'd expected. Not about the ceremony itself, that didn't matter, but about what it meant. She'd be Mara Kerr instead of Mara Quinn. She'd be tied to this ranch, this life, this man. It wasn't the future she'd imagined for herself, but then again, she'd stopped imagining futures years ago. She'd been too busy surviving. The night before they were supposed to go to town, a storm rolled in. Not just snow, but a full blizzard, the kind that buried fences and trapped livestock and made travel impossible. They woke to find the world erased, nothing visible beyond the windows but white chaos. "We'll have to wait," Wyatt said, peering out at the storm. "Could be days before this clears." Mara felt an odd mix of relief and disappointment. Relief because it gave her more time to prepare herself mentally. Disappointment because it delayed the protection marriage would provide. They spent the storm-bound days working inside, Mara mending and cooking, Wyatt fixing tools and oiling leather. The wind screamed around the house like a living thing, and the walls creaked under the weight of driven snow. But inside, they were warm and safe. On the second day of the storm, Mara was kneading bread dough when she heard Wyatt make a sound, half grunt, half curse. She turned to see him examining his hand, blood welling from a cut across his palm. "What happened?" She rushed over. Knife slipped. He pressed his other hand over the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "It's not deep, just—" "Let me see." Mara grabbed a clean cloth and moved his hand away. The cut was jagged, still bleeding freely. "You need stitches." "I can't stitch my own hand." "Then I'll do it." She'd watched her mother tend wounds before, had helped with smaller cuts and scrapes, but she'd never done stitches herself. Wyatt must have seen the uncertainty in her face. "You sure?" "No, but we don't have a choice, do we?" She got the whiskey from the high shelf, poured some over the wound, then handed him the bottle. "Drink. This is going to hurt." She threaded the needle with steady hands, though her heart was racing. Wyatt drank deeply from the bottle, then set it aside and held out his hand. "Do it quick!" Mara had to get close to see properly in the dim light. She positioned herself across from him, cradling his injured hand in her lap, and made the first stitch. Wyatt hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. She worked as quickly as she could, her fingers sure despite her nerves, drawing the edges of the wound together with small, neat stitches. "Where'd you learn this?" Wyatt asked through gritted teeth. "My mother. She was always patching up my father after one accident or another." Mara tied off another stitch. "He was a good rancher, but clumsy. Always cutting himself or getting kicked by a horse." "Sounds like me." Wyatt managed a weak smile. "Sarah used to say I was accident-prone." "Were you?" "Still am, apparently." When the last stitch was in place, Mara wrapped his hand in clean cloth and tied it securely. "Done. Try not to use it for a few days. Kind of hard to work one-handed." "Then I'll work for both of us." She looked up and realized how close they were sitting, her hand still cradling his injured one. His eyes were very blue in the firelight, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for taking care of me." "That's what partners do," Mara replied, but her voice came out softer than she'd intended. The moment stretched between them, fragile and strange. Then Wyatt cleared his throat and pulled his hand back gently. "I should check on the animals before the light fails." "Be careful with that hand." "Yes, ma'am." After he'd gone outside, Mara sat by the fire, staring at her own hands. They were trembling now, though they'd been steady while she worked. Something had shifted in that moment of closeness, something she couldn't quite name. It scared her, the way her heart had started beating faster when she'd looked into his eyes. It scared her because she'd promised herself she wouldn't feel anything beyond gratitude and relief. She'd promised herself this marriage would be practical, businesslike, safe. But feelings, she was learning, didn't follow promises. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving the world buried under fresh snow, but the sky bright and clear. Wyatt's hand was healing well. Mara checked it every day, changing the bandage, watching for signs of infection. The stitches held, and the cut was closing cleanly. "You did good work," he told her as she rewrapped his hand. "Might have a scar, but it's healing straight. Good. I was worried I'd done it wrong." "You did it perfect." His eyes met hers, warm with something that might have been pride. "You're stronger than you think, Mara Quinn." "Not Quinn for much longer," she reminded him. "No, Mara Kerr, how does that sound?" She tested the name silently, feeling how it fit in her mouth. Different, but not bad. They prepared for the trip to town carefully. Wyatt cleaned his good suit, dark wool, slightly moth-eaten, the one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral. Mara had nothing suitable for a wedding, even a practical one, but she found an old dress of Sarah's in a trunk upstairs. It was simple blue cotton, faded but clean, and it fit her well enough with some quick alterations. The morning they left, Mara stood in front of the mirror upstairs, looking at herself in Sarah's dress. She looked different somehow, older, more certain, like the girl who'd been sold from a wagon was becoming someone else, someone stronger. "You ready?" Wyatt called from downstairs. Mara took a deep breath. "Ready." The ride to Coldwater took 2 hours through snow-packed roads. They didn't talk much, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what they were about to do. When the town came into view, Mara felt her stomach clench with nerves. "What if someone recognizes me?" she asked. "What if they tell Eunice?" "Let them tell her." Wyatt's voice was firm. "Once we're married, there's nothing she can do about it. That's the whole point." The county clerk's office was in the same building as the land office, a 2-story structure at the end of Main Street. Wyatt tied the horse and helped Mara down, his injured hand making him awkward. Together, they climbed the steps and went inside. The clerk was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up when they entered, his expression politely curious. "Help you folks?" "We need a marriage license," Wyatt said. The clerk pulled out a form and began filling it in. "Names?" "Wyatt Kerr and Mara Quinn." The clerk's pen paused. "Quinn? Any relation to Eunice Vale? She was in here a few weeks back asking about land deeds." Mara's blood went cold, but Wyatt answered smoothly. "Mara was her stepdaughter, but Eunice sold her guardianship rights to me last month. We're here to make the arrangement permanent." The clerk's eyebrows rose. "Sold her guardianship? That's unusual." "Times are hard," Wyatt said evenly. "People do what they need to do. The paperwork's all legal and filed. You can check if you want." The clerk seemed to consider this, then shrugged. "Not my business, long as everything's legal." He finished filling out the form. "You'll need a witness and someone to perform the ceremony. Justice of the Peace is in his office down the hall. Probably get him to do it now if you want." "We want," Wyatt said. 20 minutes later, they stood in front of Justice Martin, a portly man with kind eyes and a booming voice, while the clerk served as witness. The ceremony was short, functional, nothing like the weddings Mara had imagined as a girl. No flowers, no music, no celebration. Just words read from a book, and 2 people saying "I do" because it was the practical thing to do. But when Wyatt slipped a thin gold band onto her finger, Sarah's ring, she realized, which he must have saved, Mara felt tears prick her eyes. This wasn't real, she reminded herself. This was business. This was protection. This was survival. So why did her heart feel like it was breaking and mending at the same time? "I now pronounce you man and wife," Justice Martin declared. "You may kiss the bride." Mara's eyes widened in panic. She and Wyatt hadn't discussed this part, but he seemed to understand her discomfort because he simply leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to her forehead, gentle and brief. "Congratulations," the justice said cheerfully, oblivious to the tension. "May you have many happy years together." They signed the papers, paid the fees, and walked out into the cold afternoon sun as husband and wife. "That's it then," Mara said quietly as Wyatt helped her onto the horse. "We're married." "We're married," he confirmed. "You're safe now. Legally, permanently safe." They started the ride back to the ranch, and Mara kept touching the ring on her finger, feeling its unfamiliar weight. Mrs. Mara Kerr, a married woman at 17, protected by law and bound by vows she'd never expected to speak. It should have felt like freedom, and in many ways it did, but it also felt like something else, something complicated and confusing that she didn't have words for yet. They were halfway home when they heard the gunshot. It came from somewhere ahead, sharp and clear in the cold air. Wyatt immediately pulled up, his hand going to the rifle he kept strapped to his saddle. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. Another shot, then a man's shout. They rounded a bend in the road and saw a wagon tipped on its side, one wheel broken, supplies scattered across the snow. A man stood beside it, rifle raised, facing 3 wolves that circled at a distance, their yellow eyes hungry. "Help me!" the man shouted when he saw them. "They've been stalking me for a mile." Wyatt didn't hesitate. He spurred the horse forward, raising his own rifle. The crack of his shot sent one wolf yelping away. The other 2 hesitated, then turned and loped into the trees, deciding these humans weren't worth the trouble. The man lowered his rifle, breathing hard. He was young, maybe 25, with a merchant's soft hands and city clothes. Thank God. I thought I was done for. You all right? Wyatt dismounted and checked him over. You hurt? Just scared. Wagon hit a rut and tipped. I've been stuck here for an hour. The merchant looked at Mara, still on the horse, and his eyes widened. Miss Quinn, is that you? Mara's stomach dropped. She recognized him now, Henry Paulson, a merchant who sometimes did business with Eunice. He'd been to the house several times. It's Mrs. Kerr now, Wyatt said firmly, stepping between them. We just came from town. Married this morning. Henry's face cycled through surprise, confusion, then something calculating. Does Mrs. Vale know about this? Don't see how it's any of her business, Wyatt replied. Mara's an adult free to marry who she chooses. But I thought... Henry stopped himself. Never mind. Congratulations, I suppose. They helped him right his wagon and gather his scattered supplies. All the while, Mara could feel Henry watching her, his mind clearly working through implications and gossip potential. By tomorrow, everyone in Coldwater would know about the wedding. By next week, Eunice would know. The confrontation was coming. It was only a matter of time. They made it home as darkness fell, both of them exhausted and tense. Inside, Wyatt built up the fire while Mara started making supper, their movements automatic from weeks of practice. She'll come, Mara said finally, breaking the silence. When Eunice hears we're married, she'll come here. Let her come. Wyatt's voice was hard. She's got no legal claim on you anymore. The marriage made sure of that. Legal claims don't always stop people. Mara turned to face him. She's dangerous, Wyatt. More dangerous than you know. I heard things, back when I lived with her. Things about people who crossed her, people who had accidents. Are you saying she's killed people? I'm saying she's capable of it. I'm saying she's not going to let this go just because we have a piece of paper that says we're married. Mara's hands were shaking. Maybe we should leave, go somewhere she can't find us. This is my ranch, my home. I'm not running. Wyatt crossed to her and took her shoulders gently. And I'm not letting her hurt you. That's a promise. Trust me. Mara looked up at him, at this man who was now her husband, who'd promised to protect her, who believed that right and law were stronger than Eunice's malice. She wanted to trust him. God, she wanted to believe him. But she'd learned the hard way that promises, no matter how sincere, couldn't always stand against the cruelty of the world. I trust you, she whispered anyway, because he needed to hear it, and because part of her wanted it to be true. That night, Mara moved her things upstairs to Sarah's old room. Their room now, though Wyatt had moved to the small spare room down the hall. The bed was soft, the blankets warm, the windows overlooking the snow-covered valley. It was the nicest room she'd ever slept in. But she lay awake until dawn, Sarah's ring heavy on her finger, listening to the house creak around her and wondering what she'd set in motion by saying, I do, to a man she barely knew. Wondering if she'd finally found safety, or if she'd just traded one danger for another. Wondering if Wyatt's promises were strong enough to stand against what was coming. Because Eunice was coming. Mara knew it as surely as she knew the sun would rise. Her stepmother wasn't the type to accept defeat, wasn't the type to let go of something she wanted. And what Eunice wanted was Mara's land, Mara's inheritance, Mara's life bent to her will. The marriage had protected Mara legally. But the law, Mara had learned, couldn't always protect you from the people who were willing to break it. Eunice came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the wedding, riding in a hired buggy with 2 men Mara had never seen before. They were big men, hard-looking, the kind you hired when you wanted to intimidate rather than negotiate. Mara saw them coming from the upstairs window, and her blood turned to ice water. Wyatt, she called, trying to keep her voice steady. She's here. He came up the stairs 2 at a time, looked out the window, and his jaw set in a way Mara had learned meant he was angry. Stay inside, he said. No. Mara grabbed his arm. If I hide, she wins. I need to face her. Mara, I need to face her, she repeated, and something in her voice must have convinced him because he nodded once, sharp and decisive. They went downstairs together and stood on the porch as the buggy pulled up. Eunice stepped down, wrapped in an expensive coat that Mara recognized. It had belonged to her mother. The sight of it made her hands clench into fists. Well, Eunice said, her voice dripping false sweetness. Look at you, girl, playing house with the rancher. Mrs. Kerr, Mara said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. My name is Mrs. Kerr now. Eunice's smile was sharp as broken glass. About that, I've come to inform you that your little marriage is invalid. I never gave consent, and as your legal guardian, you sold your guardianship, Wyatt interrupted, for $15. I have the bill of sale. A bill of sale obtained under false pretenses. Eunice pulled papers from her coat. My lawyer has filed a complaint with the territorial court. The sale was illegal because you can't sell a person. Therefore, I'm still Mara's legal guardian, and any marriage entered into without my consent is void. She's 17, Wyatt said, old enough to marry without guardian consent in Montana territory, but not old enough to inherit land without guardian oversight. Eunice's smile widened. Which brings us to the real issue. Mara has property, 200 acres that belong to her father. As her guardian, I have the right to manage that property until she comes of age. But if she's married, control passes to her husband, unless, of course, the marriage is declared invalid. The marriage is legal, Wyatt said flatly. We have the certificate. Justice Martin performed the ceremony. Justice Martin can be persuaded to reconsider. Eunice's eyes were cold. I have friends in this territory, Mr. Kerr. Important friends. Friends who don't like seeing young girls taken advantage of by older men. I didn't take advantage of anyone. No? You bought a deaf, helpless girl and married her within a month. How does that look to a judge? Eunice turned to Mara. Come now, girl. This has gone on long enough. Get your things. You're coming home with me. I am home, Mara said, and her voice rang clear across the yard. This is my home now. You have no claim on me. Come on. I have every claim. I'm your mother. You're not my mother. The words burst out of Mara like a dam breaking. My mother is dead. You're just the woman who married my father for his money and his land, the woman who worked me like a slave, the woman who sold me from the back of a wagon like I was livestock. Eunice's face went red. How dare you? I dare because it's the truth. Mara took a step forward, and she saw Eunice actually step back. And here's another truth. I can hear you. I've always been able to hear you. Every word you said when you thought I was deaf, every plan, every scheme, every cruel thing you did and said. I heard it all. The silence that followed was absolute. Eunice's face went from red to white, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. You're lying, she whispered. Am I? Should I tell Mr. Kerr about the man you were meeting in town? The one you promised a share of my father's land if he helped you get rid of me? Should I tell him about the night you talked about poison, about making it look like an accident? Mara's voice shook but held steady. I heard everything, Eunice. Everything. One of the hired men shifted uncomfortably. The other was staring at Eunice with new wariness. Even lies could sound like truth when spoken with enough conviction, and Mara's words had the ring of absolute certainty. She's mad, Eunice said, but her voice lacked conviction. The fever damaged her mind as well as her ears. She's delusional. She seems pretty clear-headed to me, Wyatt said quietly. And if what she says is true, if you've been plotting against her, that's attempted murder. That's a hanging offense. You have no proof, just the ravings of a disturbed girl. I have my testimony, Mara said, and I'm willing to give it in court. Are you willing to take that risk? Eunice's eyes narrowed, calculating. The silence stretched taut between them like a rope about to snap. Finally, she said, The land. Sign over the land rights to me, and I'll drop the complaint. You can keep your invalid marriage and your little ranch. I'll even pay you, say, $1,000 for your trouble. No, Mara said simply. 5,000. That's more money than you'll see in 10 years of ranching. No. You stupid girl. Eunice's mask of civility was cracking. That land is worth 10 times what this pathetic ranch is worth. You could be rich. You could go anywhere, do anything. Instead, you're choosing to stay here, playing wife to a washed-up rancher in the middle of nowhere. I'm choosing freedom, Mara replied. Something you'll never understand. Eunice stared at her for a long moment, and Mara saw something dangerous flicker in her stepmother's eyes. You'll regret this. You'll wish you'd taken my offer. Is that a threat? Wyatt asked, his voice going hard. It's a promise. Eunice climbed back into the buggy. You haven't won, girl. This isn't over. They watched the buggy disappear down the road, the two hired men looking back over their shoulders. When they were gone, Mara's legs gave out and she sat down hard on the porch steps. You did good, Wyatt said, sitting beside her. You were brave. I was terrified. Mara's hands were shaking. Wyatt, what I said about overhearing her, some of it was true, but some of it I exaggerated, made it sound worse than it was. What if she calls my bluff? What if she demands I testify? Then you testify to what you actually heard. Even half of what you said is damning enough. He put his hand over hers, stilling the trembling. But I don't think she'll push it. She's scared now. Scared of what you might say, what you might prove. That's why she offered money. She's trying to buy your silence. She meant that threat at the end, about it not being over. I know. Wyatt's jaw tightened, which means we need to be careful. I'm going to talk to the sheriff tomorrow, file a report about her showing up here with hired muscle, get it on record. Will that help? Can't hurt, and Mara, He waited until she looked at him. You need to stop sleeping with your door unlocked, and maybe keep this with you. He pulled a small pistol from his coat pocket. Do you know how to use one? My father taught me, before he died. Mara took the gun, feeling its weight in her palm. You really think she'd try something? I think desperate people do desperate things, and Eunice sounds pretty desperate. That night, Mara lay awake in her room, the pistol under her pillow, listening to every creak and groan of the house. She'd locked her door like Wyatt suggested, but she still felt exposed, vulnerable. The confrontation with Eunice had taken something out of her, not courage, but the last of her naivety. She'd known Eunice was dangerous, but seeing that cold calculation in her stepmother's eyes, hearing the naked greed in her voice, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. She must have finally fallen asleep because she woke to the sound of glass breaking downstairs. For a moment, she thought she'd dreamed it. Then she heard men's voices, low and urgent, and the sound of furniture scraping across the floor. Mara grabbed the pistol and eased her door open. The hallway was dark, but she could see flickering light coming from downstairs. Firelight, but wrong somehow. Too bright, too fast. Then she smelled it. Smoke. Wyatt! She screamed. His door burst open and he was there in his nightshirt, looking disoriented. Then he smelled the smoke too and his face went hard. Fire, he said. Go out the window. I'll get downstairs. You can't go down there. Someone's in the house. They heard it then, the sound of the front door slamming, of horses galloping away. Wyatt ran to the window and looked out, cursing. 2 riders, heading east. Eunice's men, Mara said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow and distant. Wyatt was already moving, running downstairs. Mara followed, the pistol clutched in her hand. The main room was full of smoke, and flames were crawling up the curtains, had caught on the rug near the door. Someone had thrown something through the window, oil probably, to make it burn faster. Water! Wyatt was already grabbing buckets, throwing water on the flames. Mara ran to help, filling every container she could find, working frantically. The smoke was thick and choking, making her eyes stream, making it hard to breathe. They fought the fire for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. When the last flame was finally out, they collapsed on the floor, coughing and gasping, covered in soot and ash. The damage could have been worse. The curtains were destroyed, part of the wall was blackened, the rug was a total loss. But the house still stood. They'd caught it in time. She tried to burn us alive, Mara said when she could speak again. Eunice tried to kill us. We don't know it was her. Who else would it be? She threatened us this morning. Tonight someone breaks in and sets fire to the house. That's not coincidence. Wyatt ran a hand through his hair, leaving sooty streaks. We need to go to the sheriff. Now. Tonight. They rode to town through the darkness, both of them still in their nightclothes with coats thrown over, both of them smelling of smoke and fear. The sheriff lived above the jail, and Wyatt pounded on his door until lights appeared and Sheriff Dutton opened up, looking annoyed. This better be good, Kerr, he growled. Then he saw their faces, smelled the smoke on them, and his expression changed. What happened? They told him everything. Eunice's visit, her threats, the fire. Wyatt's voice was steady and factual, but Mara could hear the anger underneath, barely controlled. Sheriff Dutton listened, asked questions, took notes. When they were finished, he sat back and rubbed his face. This is serious, arson. Attempted murder, possibly. But without witnesses, without proof, it was Eunice's men. Who else would it be? Wyatt demanded. I believe you. I do. But believing and proving are different things. The sheriff stood and reached for his coat. I'll ride out to the Vale place first thing in the morning, question her, see if her men have alibis. But Kerr, he fixed them with a serious look. You two need to be careful. If Eunice is willing to burn down your house, she might try worse. They rode back to the ranch as dawn was breaking, painting the sky pink and gold. The house looked different in the morning light, damaged, wounded, but still standing. Like them, Mara thought. Still standing despite everything. We should fix the window first, Wyatt said, surveying the damage in the daylight. Keep the cold out, then we'll see about the rest. They worked all day, boarding up the broken window, scrubbing soot from the walls, airing out the smoke smell. Mara caught herself jumping at every sound, her hand going to the pistol she'd tucked in her pocket. The sense of safety she'd been building over the past weeks was gone, shattered like the window glass. Talk to me, Wyatt said during a break for lunch. You've been quiet all morning. I'm scared, Mara admitted. I thought getting married would solve things. I thought legal protection would be enough. But it's not, is it? She's not going to stop. No, probably not. Wyatt set down his coffee cup. Which means we need to think strategically. What does Eunice really want? The land. My father's land. That's all she's ever wanted. And why can't she get it now that you're married? Because it's mine. The inheritance passes to me when I turn 21, or when I marry. Since I'm married, it's mine to control. Legally, you as my husband could control it, but you'd have to act on my behalf with my consent. So she needs either to prove the marriage is invalid, or to get you to sign it over to her, or, Wyatt paused, or to get rid of both of us. The words hung in the air between them, cold and terrible. She'd kill us, Mara said slowly, make it look like an accident. Then, as my only living relative, she could claim the estate. Which means we need to make sure that can't happen. We need to file paperwork making it clear that if anything happens to you, the land doesn't go to her. A will, maybe. Or a trust. Wyatt was thinking out loud now, working through the problem. And we need witnesses. People who know what's been happening, who could testify if needed. Who would believe us over her? She has money, connections, friends in important places. We have the truth, and the truth has a way of coming out. Wyatt stood and pulled Mara to her feet. Come on, we're going back to town. We're going to see a lawyer, file all the paperwork we need, and make sure Eunice can't profit from hurting us. Then we're going to spread the word, tell everyone what she's been doing, what she tried to do. Make it public enough that she can't try anything without everyone knowing who to suspect. It was a good plan, a logical plan. But as they rode back to town for the second time in 24 hours, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that logic wouldn't be enough. Because Eunice didn't operate on logic. She operated on greed and cruelty, and a willingness to do whatever it took to get what she wanted. The lawyer, Mr. Garrett, was a thin man with sharp eyes who listened to their story without interrupting. When they finished, he steepled his fingers and thought for a long moment. You're right to be concerned, he said finally. Mrs. Vale has been quite active lately, filing motions, making claims, generally causing trouble. But you're also in a strong position. The marriage is legal, the land inheritance is clear, and attempted arson is a serious crime. Can we prove she was behind it? Mara asked. That's the sheriff's job, but what we can do is protect you going forward. I'll draft a will for you, Mrs. Kerr, specifically excluding Mrs. Vale from any inheritance. I'll also draw up a formal declaration of your marriage's validity, with affidavits from the justice who performed it. And, he paused, I'll file a restraining order. If Mrs. Vale comes onto your property again, she can be arrested. How long will all this take? Wyatt asked. The will and declaration a few days, the restraining order can be filed immediately. Mr. Garrett pulled out papers and began writing. In the meantime, I'd suggest you stay vigilant. Keep witnesses around when possible. Document everything. And if she approaches you again, don't engage. Just report it to the authorities. They left the lawyer's office with a stack of papers and a plan. It should have made Mara feel better, but the knot of anxiety in her chest only tightened. They were doing everything right, following every legal avenue, building their case. But the law moved slowly, and Eunice moved fast. That night, neither of them slept well. Mara kept waking to phantom sounds, her hand going to the pistol under her pillow. Once, she thought she heard horses outside and crept to the window, but saw nothing but darkness and snow. Another time, she heard footsteps in the hall and nearly shot Wyatt when he appeared, checking on her. "Sorry," he said quietly. "I heard you moving around, just wanted to make sure you were all right." "I keep thinking they're coming back." Mara set the pistol down with shaking hands. "Every sound, every shadow, I think it's them." Wyatt sat on the edge of her bed, careful to maintain distance. "We're going to get through this, I promise." "You keep making promises." Mara's voice broke. "But what if you can't keep them? What if she wins? What if—" "Hey," he caught her hands in his, steadying them. "Look at me. We're not going to let her win. We're going to fight, and we're going to survive. And we're going to make sure she pays for what she's done. Together. You understand?" Mara nodded, not trusting her voice. In the dim light from the hallway, Wyatt's face was all angles and shadows, his eyes serious and steady. She realized suddenly how much she'd come to depend on him, this man who'd been a stranger 2 months ago. How much she trusted him, despite all her promises to herself not to trust anyone. "I'm glad you bought me," she whispered. "That day in town. I'm glad it was you." Something shifted in Wyatt's expression. "I'm glad too," he said quietly. Then, as if the word surprised him, "I've been less lonely since you came. The house feels different, better. Even with someone trying to burn it down." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Even then." They sat there for a moment, hands clasped, and Mara felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not just gratitude, not just relief. Something more complicated, more dangerous, more real than she'd expected to feel for a man she'd married out of necessity. "Get some sleep," Wyatt said, releasing her hands and standing. "I'll be right down the hall. Anything happens, you shout." "I will." After he'd gone, Mara lay back down, but sleep was a long time coming. She thought about Wyatt's words, about the house feeling better with her in it. She thought about how natural it had become to work beside him, to eat meals together, to share silence and conversation. She thought about how, somewhere along the way, this arrangement of convenience had started feeling like something more, and that terrified her almost as much as Eunice did. The next few days passed in tense anticipation. Sheriff Dutton came by to report that he'd questioned Eunice and her hired men. All three had alibis for the night of the fire. Eunice claimed she'd been home with her housekeeper, and the men claimed they'd been drinking at a saloon 20 miles away. The bartender backed up their story, though the sheriff noted he seemed nervous. "I know they're lying," he told Wyatt and Mara. "But without proof, my hands are tied. Best I can do is keep an eye on them, make it known I'm watching." Mr. Garrett delivered the completed paperwork, the will, the declarations, the restraining order. Everything was filed and official. Legally, Mara and Wyatt were as protected as they could be. But legal protection, they were learning, was a thin shield against determined malice. It was during the second week after the fire that the real blow came. Wyatt had ridden into town for supplies, and Mara was alone at the ranch, cleaning the kitchen. She heard horses approaching and looked out to see 3 riders, not Eunice's hired men, but strangers, official-looking strangers. Her heart sank as they dismounted and approached the house. One of them knocked, and Mara opened the door, the pistol hidden in her skirt pocket. "Mrs. Kerr?" the lead man asked. He was older, distinguished, with a badge pinned to his coat. "I'm Marshal Crawford, Territorial Marshal. I have some questions for you." "About what?" Mara's mouth was dry. "About your marriage to Wyatt Kerr. We've received a complaint alleging coercion, fraud, and an illegal guardianship transfer. I'm here to investigate." Mara's blood ran cold. "Eunice." "Mrs. Vale. Yes, she's filed a formal complaint with the territorial government. Claims you were sold illegally, married against your will, and are being held on this ranch against your wishes." The marshal's eyes were sharp, assessing. Are you here of your own free will, Mrs. Kerr? Yes. Mara lifted her chin. Absolutely yes. You weren't coerced into marriage? No. I married Mr. Kerr to escape my stepmother's abuse. She sold me, Marshall. Sold me like property. The marriage was my choice, my protection. The marshal nodded slowly. That's what your lawyer claims, but Mrs. Vale has evidence suggesting otherwise. Witness statements saying you appeared frightened, that you never spoke, that you showed signs of being controlled. Because I was pretending to be deaf, the words burst out of Mara. I pretended for 5 years because it was safer than letting Eunice know I could hear her plans. She wanted my inheritance, Marshall, my father's land, and she was willing to do anything to get it, including selling me to get rid of me. If that's true, it's a serious allegation. It's true, and I can prove it. I can tell you things I overheard, things she said when she thought I couldn't hear. That's all hearsay, Mrs. Kerr, not admissible as evidence. The marshal's expression was sympathetic but firm. Look, I believe you're telling me your truth, but I have a job to do. There's going to be a hearing in 3 weeks. You and Mr. Kerr will need to appear along with Mrs. Vale. A judge will hear both sides and make a determination about the validity of the marriage and the guardianship transfer. And until then, you're free to remain here. But I'd advise you not to leave the territory. And Mrs. Kerr, he fixed her with a serious look. If you are being held against your will, now is the time to say so. I can protect you. I don't need protection from my husband, Mara said quietly. I need protection from my stepmother. But thank you, Marshall. After they left, Mara sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking. A hearing in 3 weeks, where a judge would decide if her marriage was valid, if she'd been coerced, if Eunice had any claim on her, where everything she'd fought for could be taken away with the strike of a gavel. When Wyatt returned and she told him, his face went pale. 3 weeks. That's not much time to build a defense. What defense? Eunice has money, connections, witnesses who'll say whatever she pays them to say. What do we have? We have the truth. The truth didn't stop the marshal from looking at me like I might be a victim who doesn't know she's been victimized. Mara stood and paced, too agitated to sit still. Wyatt, what if we lose? What if the judge sides with her? Then we appeal. We fight. We don't give up. And if that doesn't work, if she gets guardianship back? Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, then we run. We leave the territory, go somewhere she can't follow, start over. Leave your ranch? Your home? Home isn't a place, Wyatt said quietly. I'm starting to understand that. Home is... He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. Home is where you feel safe, where you belong. If this place isn't safe anymore, then it's not home. Not really. Mara stared at him, shocked. You'd do that? Give up everything you've built here? I already lost everything once when Sarah died. The ranch, the house, the land. They're just things. They can't love you back. They can't make you laugh or challenge you or make you want to be better than you are. He met her eyes, and Mara saw something raw and honest in his expression. These past weeks with you here, that's the most alive I've felt in 3 years. If I have to choose between keeping this place and keeping you safe, there's no choice. Not for me. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them quite knew how to address. Mara felt her heart hammering, felt tears pricking her eyes, felt something huge and terrifying and wonderful swelling in her chest. Wyatt, she started, but didn't know how to finish. He seemed to shake himself, stepping back. We'll prepare for the hearing. Get our story straight, gather whatever evidence we can, maybe find character witnesses who will speak for us, and we'll hope that justice prevails. And if it doesn't, then we'll figure it out together. He managed a tired smile. That's what partners do, right? Right, Mara whispered. That night, as Mara lay in bed, she touched the ring on her finger and thought about Wyatt's words, about home not being a place, about feeling alive, about choosing her safety over everything he'd built. When had this stopped being just an arrangement? When had Wyatt Kerr stopped being just the man who'd bought her and started being the man she couldn't imagine living without? When had her gratitude transformed into something deeper, something that made her chest ache when she looked at him, something that felt dangerously like love. She didn't have answers, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would fight for this. For him, for them, for whatever they were becoming. She'd fought her whole life just to survive. Now she'd fight for something more. She'd fight for a chance at happiness, for a real home, for a future that wasn't just about escaping the past, but about building something new. And if Eunice wanted to take that away, she'd find that the girl she'd thought was broken and helpless had learned to fight back. The hearing was in 3 weeks. Mara intended to win. The 3 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Wyatt and Mara spent their days gathering evidence. The bill of sale from Eunice, statements from townspeople who'd witnessed the auction, records from the county clerk. Mr. Garrett worked tirelessly, building their case piece by piece, but even he admitted their position was precarious. The law around guardianship and women's rights is murky at best, he told them during one of their meetings. Judges have wide discretion. A lot will depend on how you present yourselves, how credible you seem, whether the judge believes your marriage is genuine or a legal maneuver. It is genuine, Mara said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. What had started as necessity had become something real, something she couldn't quite define but felt in her bones. Wyatt glanced at her, something unreadable in his eyes. It's genuine, he confirmed. The night before they were to leave for the territorial capital, where the hearing would be held, neither of them could sleep. Mara found Wyatt sitting on the porch in the darkness, staring out at the snow-covered valley. You should be resting, she said, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. Can't. Too much thinking. He gestured to the space beside him on the bench. Join me? She sat, and for a while they just listened to the night sounds. Wind in the pines, an owl calling somewhere distant, the creak of the house settling. It was Wyatt who finally broke the silence. I've been thinking about what happens if we lose tomorrow, he said quietly. About running, starting over somewhere new, and I realized something. He turned to look at her, his face half shadowed in the moonlight. I don't want to run. Not because of the ranch or the land. I don't want to run because it would mean Eunice won. It would mean cruelty and greed triumph over what's right. And I'm tired of that. I'm tired of letting fear make the decisions. So what do? We walk into that courtroom tomorrow, and we tell the truth. All of it. We tell them who you really are, what she really did, and we trust that somewhere in this broken system there's still room for justice. He reached over and took her hand. And whatever happens, we face it together. Mara looked down at their joined hands, at Sarah's ring glinting on her finger. I'm scared, she admitted. Me too. Wyatt's grip tightened, but I'm less scared with you beside me than I've been of anything in 3 years. That has to count for something. Wyatt, I need to tell you something. Mara's voice was barely above a whisper. This marriage, it stopped being just practical for me. Somewhere along the way, it became real. You became real. And I don't know when it happened or how, but She faltered, searching for words. I care about you, more than I thought I could care about anyone. Wyatt went very still. Mara, you don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know, before tomorrow, in case, her voice broke, in case everything goes wrong. Nothing's going wrong. Wyatt shifted to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face. And you're right, this stopped being just practical. It became real for me too. I don't know when, maybe when you stitched up my hand, maybe when you stood up to Eunice. Maybe it was always heading this direction, and I was just too stubborn to see it. What are you saying? I'm saying I care about you too. I'm saying that these weeks with you have reminded me what it feels like to be alive instead of just existing. I'm saying, he took a breath. I'm saying I think I'm falling in love with you, Mara Kerr, and that terrifies me because I thought I'd never feel this way again after Sarah. Tears spilled down Mara's cheeks. You're sure? Because I couldn't bear it if you said this now and changed your mind later. I couldn't. He kissed her. Gentle at first, almost hesitant, then deeper when she responded. It was nothing like the chaste kiss at their wedding. This was real and raw and full of all the things they'd been too afraid to say. When they finally pulled apart, Both of them were breathing hard. "I'm sure," Wyatt said firmly. "Are you?" "Yes," Mara laughed through her tears. "God help me. Yes." They sat together on the porch until dawn, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for a future they might not get to have, holding on to each other like lifelines. When the sun finally rose, painting the snow pink and gold, they went inside to prepare for the journey ahead. The ride to Helena, the territorial capital, took 2 days. They traveled in silence mostly, both lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them. When they finally reached the city, it seemed impossibly large and bustling after the quiet isolation of the ranch. People filled the streets, carriages rattled past, buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high. Mr. Garrett met them at the courthouse, his face grave. "I need to prepare you," he said. "Mrs. Vale has brought 5 witnesses. They're claiming you were coerced, that you showed signs of abuse, that the marriage was arranged against your will." "That's all lies," Mara said. "I know, but lies told convincingly can be as powerful as truth." He led them inside the massive stone building. The judge is Hiram Blackwell. He's fair but conservative. He doesn't like seeing the law twisted for personal gain, but he also doesn't like seeing young women taken advantage of. We need to convince him you're the former, not the latter. The courtroom was smaller than Mara expected, wood-paneled and solemn. Eunice was already there with her lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit. She looked prosperous and respectable, every inch the concerned guardian fighting for her stepdaughter's welfare. When her eyes met Mara's, they were cold as winter ice. Judge Blackwell entered, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes and a weathered face that suggested he'd seen every kind of human foolishness. He called the court to order and asked Eunice's lawyer to present his case. What followed was a masterclass in manipulation. Eunice's lawyer painted a picture of a vulnerable deaf girl sold by her desperate guardian to an older man who'd taken advantage of her disability. He called witness after witness, people from Coldwater who testified that Mara had never spoken, had appeared frightened and submissive, had shown all the signs of someone being controlled. She was terrified that day of the auction, one woman testified, sitting in that wagon like a trapped animal. It was heartbreaking. "I saw Mr. Kerr at the auction," testified Samuel Worth, the saloon owner. "He looked at that girl like she was a piece of property he was evaluating. Made my skin crawl." Each testimony felt like a nail in their coffin. Mara watched the judge's face, trying to read his reaction, but he remained impassive. Then it was their turn. Mr. Garrett called Wyatt first, and he told their story from his perspective. The auction, the purchase, the discovery that Mara could hear, the marriage to protect her from Eunice's machinations. He was calm and straightforward, but Mara could see the lawyer preparing to tear his testimony apart. "Mr. Kerr," Eunice's lawyer said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you're a lonely widower who purchased a young, vulnerable girl to serve as a replacement for his dead wife?" "No," Wyatt's voice was firm. "I bought Mara because watching someone be sold like livestock turned my stomach. I married her to protect her from a woman who'd already proven she saw her as property. How convenient that this protection came with control of valuable land. I don't want her land. I want her safe." "Do you expect us to believe that a 42-year-old man married a 17-year-old girl out of pure altruism? I expect you to believe I married a woman I've come to love because she deserves better than what life has given her." Wyatt's eyes found Mara's across the courtroom. "And because she makes me want to be better than I've been." The lawyer tried to push further, but Judge Blackwell interrupted. "I think we've established Mr. Kerr's motives sufficiently. Call your next witness." Mr. Garrett stood. "The defense calls Mara Kerr." Mara's legs felt weak as she walked to the witness stand, but she kept her head high. She'd survived Eunice's cruelty for years. She could survive this. Mr. Garrett started with gentle questions, her childhood, her father's death, life with Eunice. Mara answered clearly, her voice steady. Then he asked about the deafness. "Tell the court the truth, Mrs. Kerr. Can you hear?" "Yes." Mara looked directly at Eunice as she spoke. "I've been able to hear for the past 5 years. Not perfectly. The fever damaged my hearing. But I can hear loud sounds, voices when someone speaks clearly. I let everyone believe I was completely deaf because it was safer. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Blackwell leaned forward. Safer how? Because people say things around deaf girls they wouldn't say otherwise. My stepmother talked about her plans, her schemes, things she wanted hidden. As long as she thought I couldn't hear, I was invisible. And invisible meant I could survive. What kinds of plans did you overhear? Mr. Garrett asked. Plans to sell my father's land, to get rid of me so she could claim I'd abandoned my inheritance, to marry me off to someone who would sign over the land rights. Mara's voice shook but held. And once, late at night when she thought I was asleep, I heard her talking to a man about poison, about how accidents happen on ranches all the time, about how problem girls sometimes disappear. That's a lie. Eunice was on her feet, her face red with fury. She's lying. The fever made her mad. She hears things that were never said. Order! Judge Blackwell's gavel cracked down. Mrs. Vale, you'll have your chance to speak. Sit down. Tell me about the auction, Mr. Garrett continued, about Mr. Kerr buying you. I was terrified, Mara admitted, but not of him, of where I'd end up, who would buy me, what they'd do with me. When Wyatt, Mr. Kerr, when he bought me and took me to his ranch, he gave me food and shelter and asked for nothing in return. He taught me ranch work. He treated me like a person, not property. He never once tried to hurt me or take advantage of me. And the marriage? Was my choice, my decision. Wyatt proposed it as protection when we learned Eunice wanted to challenge the sale, but it became more than protection. Mara looked at Wyatt again, and this time she let everything she felt show in her face. It became real. He became real to me. He's the first person in 5 years who's made me feel safe enough to use my voice, to be myself, to hope for a future. Eunice's lawyer stood for cross-examination, and he was merciless. He questioned her about every detail of her story, trying to trip her up, to find inconsistencies. He suggested she'd been coached, that she was suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, that she couldn't possibly know her own mind at 17. Isn't it true, Miss Quinn? Mrs. Kerr, Mara interrupted. Isn't it true that you're so desperate for approval, for affection, that you've convinced yourself you love the man who bought you? No. Mara's voice rang clear. I love him because he's kind, because he's patient, because when I told him I'd been lying about being deaf, he understood instead of being angry, because he makes me coffee in the morning and teaches me to play cards and looks at me like I matter. Her voice cracked. I love him because he's the only person who's ever made me feel like I deserve to be loved. The courtroom was silent. Even the lawyer seemed at a loss for words. Judge Blackwell made a note, his expression still unreadable. Does the defense have any other witnesses? He asked. Yes, Your Honor. We call Eunice Vale. Eunice took the stand with perfect composure, every inch the wronged guardian. She testified that she'd only sold Mara because she couldn't afford to care for her anymore, that the auction had broken her heart, that discovering Mara had been married to an older man had devastated her. I only want what's best for my stepdaughter, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. I want her protected, cared for, safe from those who would exploit her. Mrs. Vale, Mr. Garrett said during his cross-examination, why did you accept money for Mara if you cared so much about her welfare? I was desperate. I had no choice. But you had a house, land, resources from your late husband's estate. Why were you so desperate? The estate was smaller than expected. Medical bills. Debts. Medical bills? Mr. Garrett pulled out papers. According to county records, you paid cash for a new carriage just 2 weeks before the auction. You bought 3 new dresses from the dressmaker. You donated $50 to the church. These don't sound like the actions of a desperate woman. Eunice's composure cracked slightly. I had to maintain appearances. Or you wanted Mara gone so you could claim her inheritance. Mr. Garrett's voice was sharp. Isn't it true that Mara owns 200 acres of prime land with water and timber rights? Land you've been trying to gain control of since your husband died? Isn't it true that you've met multiple times with land speculators about selling that property? That you've tried to forge documents claiming abandonment so you could take control? I object. Eunice's lawyer was on his feet. These are unsubstantiated allegations. They're documented meetings, Your Honor, Mr. Garrett said, producing more papers. 3 different witnesses place Mrs. Vale in discussions about the land. She can't sell it legally while Mara is alive and competent. But if Mara were declared incompetent, or if her marriage were declared invalid, and she were returned to Mrs. Vale's guardianship, then she could do whatever she wanted with it, Judge Blackwell finished. He fixed Eunice with a hard stare. Is this true, Mrs. Vale? Have you been plotting to gain control of your stepdaughter's inheritance? It's complicated. Eunice's mask was slipping, desperation showing through. The girl doesn't understand what she has. She'd waste it, squander it. I was trying to protect the estate. By selling the heir? The judge's voice was cold. Mrs. Vale, I've seen a lot of things in my years on the bench, but this might be the most transparently self-serving case I've encountered. Your Honor, please. I've heard enough. Judge Blackwell stood. I'll render my decision after a brief recess. The 30 minutes of recess felt like hours. Mara sat with Wyatt and Mr. Garrett in a small waiting room, too nervous to speak. Wyatt held her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, and that simple touch was the only thing keeping her grounded. When they were called back in, Judge Blackwell looked tired but resolved. I've considered all the testimony and evidence presented, he began. This is a complex case involving questions of guardianship, consent, and the rights of women under territorial law. However, certain facts are clear. Mrs. Eunice Vale sold her stepdaughter for money, demonstrating that she viewed Mara Quinn as property rather than a person under her care. Whether or not this sale was legal is irrelevant to the larger issue. Mrs. Vale has proven herself an unfit guardian. Eunice made a sound of protest, but the judge silenced her with a look. Furthermore, I find the testimony of Mara Kerr to be credible and compelling. Her account of pretending to be deaf for self-preservation shows remarkable intelligence and survival instinct. Her decision to marry Mr. Kerr, whether initially motivated by protection or not, appears to have been made freely and with full understanding of her actions. She is 17 years old, legally old enough to marry without guardian consent in this territory. Judge Blackwell shuffled his papers. As for the allegations of coercion and abuse, I find no evidence to support them. Mr. Kerr's testimony was straightforward and honest. The marriage certificate is valid and properly filed. And most tellingly, Mrs. Kerr herself testified clearly and firmly that the marriage was her choice and has become genuine. Mara felt Wyatt's hand tighten on hers, felt hope beginning to bloom in her chest. Therefore, I rule as follows, the judge continued. The marriage between Wyatt Kerr and Mara Kerr is declared legal and valid. Eunice Vale's guardianship is permanently terminated. Mrs. Vale is ordered to cease all contact with Mara Kerr and is prohibited from making any further claims on Mara's inheritance. Additionally, I'm referring this case to the territorial attorney for investigation of possible fraud and attempted theft related to the land inheritance. Your Honor, please. Eunice's lawyer tried to interrupt, but Judge Blackwell wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the evidence of attempted arson and the suspicious timing of various incidents, I'm ordering the territorial marshal to investigate Mrs. Vale's possible involvement in criminal activities against the Kerrs. Mrs. Vale, if you're found to have engaged in arson, attempted murder, or conspiracy to commit either, you will face the full weight of the law. Eunice's face had gone pale. She stood, looking like she wanted to run, but 2 marshals moved to flank her. This court is adjourned. The judge's gavel came down with finality. For a moment, Mara couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then Wyatt pulled her into his arms, and she was laughing and crying at the same time, relief flooding through her so powerfully it made her dizzy. "We won," she gasped. "Wyatt, we won." "You won," he corrected, pulling back to look at her. "You stood up there and told the truth even though you were terrified. You were so brave, Mara." "We were brave," she insisted. "Together." Mr. Garrett was beaming. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kerr. You're officially free." Free. The word echoed in Mara's mind, strange and wonderful, and almost impossible to believe. She was free of Eunice, free of fear, free to make her own choices about her life. The weight she'd been carrying for 5 years lifted, and she felt light enough to float. They stayed in Helena for 2 more days while the paperwork was finalized and the marshals took statements about the fire. Eunice was arrested on fraud charges related to her attempts to forge abandonment documents for the land. Her hired men, faced with serious charges, quickly turned on her and confessed to setting the fire on her orders. By the time Wyatt and Mara left the city, Eunice was in jail awaiting trial, and her lawyer had fled town. The ride back to the ranch felt different than the journey out. The landscape was the same, snow and pine trees and endless sky. But everything had changed. Mara wasn't running toward an uncertain future anymore. She was going home, to a place where she belonged, with a man she loved, to build a life she'd chosen. When they finally saw the ranch house in the distance, Wyatt pulled the horse to a stop. "What's wrong?" Mara asked. "Nothing's wrong." He dismounted and helped her down, then took both her hands in his. "I just want to say this before we get back, before real life starts again, and we get busy with all the things that need doing." "Say what?" "That I meant what I said in court. I love you, Mara. Not because you need protecting, or because circumstances pushed us together. I love you because you're brave and strong and funny and kind, because you make coffee too weak and hum when you think no one's listening, because you stood up to Eunice even though you were terrified, because you're you." Mara felt tears welling up. "I love you too. I think I started loving you the night you stitched my hand, and I got to see how gentle you could be. Or maybe it was earlier, when you defended me to Eunice. Or maybe it was the first night when you said I was safe and I almost believed you." "We should probably seal this with a kiss," Wyatt said, smiling. "Probably," Mara agreed. This kiss was different from the one on the porch. That had been desperate, full of fear and uncertainty. This was full of promise and hope and the certainty that whatever came next, they'd face it together. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were grinning like fools. They rode the last mile home hand in hand, and when they reached the house, Wyatt insisted on carrying Mara over the threshold. "This is silly," she protested, laughing. "We've been married for weeks. We've lived here together. Doesn't matter. We're doing this properly." He swept her up in his arms, making her squeal, and carried her inside. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kerr." "Welcome home, Mr. Kerr," she replied, and kissed him again because she could, because she wanted to, because he was her husband in truth now, and not just on paper. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Mara's life. They fell into new rhythms, working the ranch together during the day, cooking and talking and laughing in the evenings. Wyatt taught her to ride properly, to shoot straight, to read the weather in the clouds. Mara taught him that life didn't have to be so serious all the time, that laughter was allowed, that joy could coexist with memory. They talked about Sarah sometimes, and Wyatt showed Mara pictures, told stories, shared the grief he'd been carrying alone for so long. Mara listened and understood that loving her didn't mean he'd stopped loving Sarah. Hearts, she was learning, were big enough for both. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the frozen ground. True to Wyatt's word, the meadow exploded with purple lupines, thousands of them swaying in the breeze. Mara stood in the middle of them one morning, turning in circles, laughing at the sheer beauty of it all. "You were right," she called to Wyatt, who was watching from the fence. "More color than I know what to do with." "Come back in summer," he called back. "Wait until you see the wildflowers then." They received word that Eunice had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud, attempted arson, and conspiracy. Her hired men got 2 years each. The news should have brought satisfaction, but Mara found she mostly felt sad. Sad for what Eunice had become, for the choices that had led her to such cruelty, for the waste of it all. "She made her choices," Wyatt said when Mara confessed these feelings. "You can feel sad about it, but don't feel guilty. You didn't do this to her. She did it to herself." In May, they traveled to Mara's father's land, her land now, and walked its boundaries. It was beautiful country, rolling hills and streams and stands of timber. They talked about what to do with it, how to manage it, whether to sell it or hold it or build on it. "We could build a house here someday," Wyatt suggested. "Something bigger than the ranch house. Room for—" He stopped, looking suddenly shy. "Room for what?" Mara prompted, smiling because she knew what he was trying to say. "Room for a family. If that's something you might want. Someday." "I'd like that," Mara said softly. "A family. A real home. A future." She took his hand. All of it. With you. In June, Justice Martin came to the ranch for dinner, and over roast chicken and potatoes, he told them stories about the early days of the territory, about outlaws and heroes and ordinary people trying to build lives in impossible places. "You two remind me of the best of them," he said. "The ones who didn't let hardship break them, who found each other in the darkness and made light." "That's poetic, Justice," Wyatt said, smiling. "It's true," the old man insisted. "I've married a lot of couples in my time, some for love, some for land, some for convenience. But I've never seen two people grow into love the way you two have. You're going to make it, I think. You're going to be one of the success stories." After he'd gone, Mara and Wyatt sat on the porch watching the stars come out. She leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, and thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that snowy day in Coldwater when she'd been sold like property to now, sitting safe and loved and free under a sky full of stars. "What are you thinking?" Wyatt asked quietly. "That I'm grateful. For all of it, even the hard parts, because they led me here, to you, to this life. Even being sold from a wagon? Even that." Mara looked up at him. Because if Eunice hadn't sold me, if you hadn't bought me, if we hadn't been pushed together by circumstances, we might never have found each other, and that would have been the real tragedy. Wyatt kissed her forehead. "You know what Sarah used to say? She said the universe has a way of putting people where they need to be, even if the path there is hard. I never believed her. Thought it was just wishful thinking, but now..." He pulled Mara closer. "Now, I think maybe she was right." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called. Mara heard it clearly, not perfectly, but clearly enough, and smiled. She could hear, she could speak, she could laugh and love and live without fear. The girl who'd been sold that winter day didn't exist anymore. She'd been reborn into Mara Kerr, wife and partner and owner of her own destiny. The deaf girl who'd never spoken had found her voice. The frightened girl who'd trusted no one had learned to trust and love. The girl who'd been told she was worthless had discovered her own worth. And the lonely rancher who'd bought her hadn't purchased a servant or a replacement for his lost wife. He'd found a partner, a love, a reason to stop grieving and start living again. In July, they held a real wedding celebration. Small and simple, just friends from town and neighboring ranchers, but it felt important to mark the occasion properly. To stand before witnesses and say the vows again, this time with full hearts and clear understanding of what they meant. Mara wore a new dress, white with blue flowers, and carried a bouquet of lupines from their meadow. Wyatt wore his good suit and looked at her like she'd hung the moon. When Justice Martin pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, and Wyatt kissed her, everyone cheered. "Third time's the charm," Thomas Brennan joked. "First at the auction, second in the courtroom, third in front of God and everybody." "Actually," Mara said, laughing, "this is the fourth time. We had a ceremony at the courthouse first." "Fourth time, then. Either way, you two are properly married now. Can't get more married than this." They danced on the porch under paper lanterns Mara had made, ate food brought by neighbors who'd become friends, told stories, and laughed until their sides hurt. It was everything a wedding should be, joyful and full of love and promise for the future. As the evening wound down and guests began heading home, Mara found herself standing at the edge of the porch, looking out at the land that had become hers. Not just the ranch, but the whole valley, the mountains beyond, the endless sky overhead. This was her home, her territory, her life. "Happy?" Wyatt came to stand beside her. "Incredibly." She leaned into him. "You know what the best part is? Tell me. I'm not afraid anymore. For 5 years, I was afraid every single day. Afraid of what Eunice would do. Afraid of what would happen to me. Afraid to speak or move or exist. And now," she spread her arms wide, "now I'm not afraid of anything." "Nothing at all?" "Well," Mara amended, "I'm a little afraid of the chickens. They're mean." Wyatt laughed, the sound rich and warm. "I'll protect you from the chickens." "My hero," Mara said solemnly, then grinned. But seriously, I'm not afraid because I know whatever comes, we'll face it together. And that makes all the difference. All the difference, Wyatt agreed. They stood together as night fell completely, watching the stars emerge one by one. The house behind them was full of light and warmth. The land around them was settling into peaceful darkness. And between them was a love that had started as necessity and grown into something neither of them had been looking for but both desperately needed. Somewhere in the valley, a wolf howled. Mara heard it and smiled, remembering the wolves that had circled the merchant's wagon, the moment when she'd realized Wyatt was the kind of man who rode toward danger to help strangers. That moment had told her everything she'd needed to know about him, even if she hadn't understood it at the time. "I hear you," she whispered, though whether she was talking to the wolf or to Wyatt, or to the universe itself, she wasn't entirely sure. "I hear you too," Wyatt whispered back, understanding somehow what she meant. And in that moment, Mara Quinn Kerr, who had been sold as a deaf girl and had learned to hear, who had been told she was worthless and had learned her worth, who had been treated as property and had claimed her freedom, understood that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the best destinations. She'd been bought for $15 and had gained everything that mattered. She'd married for protection and had found love. She'd pretended to be deaf and had finally found her voice. The lonely rancher had bought a girl from the back of a wagon on the coldest day of winter. But what he'd really found was spring, renewal, growth, the promise of new life and new hope. They had said she was broken, unwanted, impossible to love, but she'd only been waiting for someone worth listening to, someone who saw her not as property or burden, but as a person deserving of respect and care and love. And the rancher who'd thought his heart had died with his wife had learned that hearts could grow, could expand, could find room for new love without diminishing the old. Together, they'd built something real from the ruins of their separate griefs. Together, they'd proven that sometimes the most unconventional beginnings lead to the strongest foundations. Together, they'd found home, not in a place, but in each other. As they finally went inside, hand in hand, the house welcomed them with warmth and light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There was always work to be done on a ranch, always problems to solve, always uncertainties to face. But they would face them together, as partners, as lovers, as husband and wife in the truest sense of all those words. The story that had begun with a sail in the snow ended with a marriage sealed by love. The girl who couldn't speak had found her voice. The man who couldn't love again had found his heart. And in the process, they'd both discovered that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of lupines and pine. Inside the house, Mara and Wyatt built up the fire and settled in for the night, warm and safe and together. And if you listened very carefully, you might hear something on that wind, something like laughter, like hope, like the sound of two people who'd been lost finally finding their way home. They belonged to no one but each other. They were deaf to cruelty, but heard love loud and clear. They had started as strangers brought together by desperation and necessity. But they would end as family, as partners, as two souls who'd found in each other exactly what they'd been missing all along. And that, after everything, was more than enough. It was everything.